we're here to, talk about what Colin just said, leveraging digital channels and how to build your following, right? So there's so many different channels that you can possibly utilize, social media, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, podcasts, voice search that Colin just mentioned, and the voice assistants and the ecosystems that power them. There are over 700,000 active podcasts, and 32% of Americans say they've listened to a podcast in the past month, which is amazing. So on the shoulders of podcasts are the voice devices like Amazon Alexa and Google Home. And let's not forget the undeniable power of social media. So I'm going to introduce some of our panelists here. We have Christopher Boon, hereafter known as Boon. You may have talked to him over at his booth over there. He's spent the first half of his career bringing brands like Red Bull, Vitamin Water, and Smart Water to market in the US, and then the last 10 years on the marketing insights and intelligence side of the industry. Currently, Boon serves as the head of enterprise solutions for the New York-based 11-year-old AI company Distillery. We have Tiara Puglisi, currently leads the connections planning team at RGA. She's the only agency side person on this panel, brand agnostic. She leads an elite team of hybrid media thinkers. They ensure creative work is built to be seen by the right people at the right time in the right place. While at RGA, Tiara has overseen connection strategies for brands such as Samsung, Verizon, Nike, and Uber. Nuria Iturrios is a Bay Area transplant that grew up in Mexico. She came to the US to finish her studies at UC Berkeley and has since worked for several different companies in Silicon Valley. Nuria leads 2 customer success channels, delivering both ongoing and net new business for the self-serve ads team at Twitter. Her goal is to help advertisers find success on the platform while growing and generating revenue. And finally, last but not least, Rahul Sabnis snagged the first ever top creative title given by iHeartMedia, Chief Creative Officer. Rahul's to-do list includes taking command of iHeart's first in-house creative group and reporting directly to Darren Davis, president of iHeartMedia and iHeartRadio. He and his team will be enriching the eyes and ears of all iHeartMedia enthusiasts through The Studio, a full-service in-house agency committed to delivering the highest level of creative to their clients. Okay, now I'm done.
That sounded really formal. I like it.
Very formal. All right, so let's get to some cool questions. All right, so let's start off with podcasts. I think this is something that everybody's interested right now in. So Pew Research says that from 2014 to 2019, podcast listenership of people that listen at least once a month has more than doubled, from 14% to 32%. Why do you think this audio-only format has grown so much? I guess we'll start with Rahul.
So at iHeart, we're super bullish on podcasts. Big reason for us is it actually has expanded our listener audience. When we think of podcasts and the people who listen to it, I mean, just as a show of hands, how many of you guys are listening to podcasts? Just cool. So that's yes. The reason you're listening to it and the way we think about it is you guys are all super fans. Think about that for a second. When you sign up and decide that you're going to subscribe to a podcast, you're not doing it passively. You actively went there and said, I want that podcast, I want to listen to it, I'm subscribing to it, and I'm going to complete that. Completion rates and skip rates are very low. For us, we've now become the #1 commercial podcaster in America, and that is not like unintended. So we're big on that, and I hope I answered the question right. So boom.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think the other reason why they've risen so much is kind of the trend that we see with everything in terms of multi-different channels, but kind of the authenticity that you get from a podcast. And I think people really want to have more of that underproduced, that conversational type medium. So I think it kind of goes to some of the other things that we'll talk about, but I think podcasts also are seeing the rise just generally because that's how people are consuming content today and the types of content that they want to see, which is a little bit less produced, very specific to the needs that they want. I think it goes to like the decrease in TV usage. No one's watching 2, 4, and 7 anymore. They're watching the things that they want to subscribe to on Netflix and things like that, and I think podcasts are another kind of result of that.
All right. Yeah, and the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the IAB, and PricewaterhouseCoopers report says that ad spending in the U.S. on podcasts jumped 53% last year to $479 million, with podcast revenue projected to grow to $1 billion by 2021. Should all brands be looking to leverage podcast advertising? Why? If not, yeah.
Rahul said yes.
Yeah. Well, yes, for us, we would thank you. Yes. The truth is, there's actually 3 ways you can use the space, to be very specific. On one level, yes, you can advertise in podcasts. Like you have like host-read endorsements of your product or service. And a lot of direct-to-consumer products have been doing that kind of thing. That's where they've actually seen a lot of growth. You know, how many of you guys are like, know what ZipRecruiter is? It's a big part of it, right? So that's level 1 where you can have that piece. Level 2 is where you can actually influence the content. So think about that for a second. We have How Stuff Works as a part of our portfolio. In fact, that we have Stuff Productions as a part of our family. Let's say Godzilla's coming out, the movie, and Stuff You Should Know in History, you influence an episode where it's about Godzilla. Suddenly you start to hear like the whole history and the importance of that, and suddenly it becomes a very different animal. And the last one is you could create a bespoke podcast, like a branded piece. So that very much sells what your brand stands for, like we did with 23andMe, and it's a podcast called Spit. So and it's all about kind of the nuance and culture of how when you start to unveil what DNA connections do with each other, suddenly you start to realize there's more to this story than just what, what we think we know, so.
Okay. Yeah, so you guys have the studio, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pandora has Studio Resonate, New York Times has T-Brands, Spotify has their own. There are all these ways that brands can activate. Is that the future? Is that what it looks like?
Yeah. I mean, I think for sure. I think it spans actually outside of podcasts. I think this one too. I think with T-Brand and what they did with Orange is the New Black, and similar to the example that Rahul just gave with the 23andMe and Spit podcast, it's actually using the platform like New York Times to create content that people care about and also foreshadow work that our clients want to put out. So for the Orange is the New Black example, they started talking about females in prisons, for example, and turned that into paid sponsored content on the platform. And it was wildly successful, and I think that's where brands can really use the power of specific providers and publishers and content providers to use that and their voice to help create that content. So I definitely think it's part of the mix, and I think it depends on your brands and if it makes sense for you and the type of play that you want to have. But I think thinking about using those different types of content providers is something that you should think about in your mix, for sure.
And Nuria, I'm going to put you on the spot here. There's Twitter Next, which is a new brand activation engine within Twitter marketing. So how can brands leverage that?
Yeah, so Twitter Next is similar to some of these other services that you mentioned. It's part of our brand strategy team within our marketing department, and we really, kind of created this engine to help advertisers stretch a little bit more creatively and how they can use Twitter. So it's just one of the resources that we have so that brands can kind of partner with us end-to-end on strategy around the campaign, content creation, assets execution, and whatnot. So we partner mostly with larger brands with big scopes and projects, but yeah, that's just one of the resources available.
I think all of them have the foundational knowledge of the platform and how people are using it. So I think if you are a brand that your audience is on New York Times or they use Twitter a lot, using these platforms to understand what they're doing and how you can make the most of it, I think is something that's worthwhile.
Okay. And I guess just a softball question for each one of you. What's your favorite podcast?
Mine is VC20. It's 20-minute segments with different investors from all over, and it's a great perspective. It's not just about finance, but industries, why scooters are not going to be able to blow up like Uber, things like that.
No comment.
I'll go with the Daily from the New York Times. It's the best way to start my day. And also the Fantasy Pros Fantasy Football Podcast.
Very nice. For me, it's Speak for Yourself. I'm a big sports nut, so Speak for Yourself is fantastic. It's my favorite.
Cool. Do I have to do it myself, I guess?
Yeah, you have to do yours. What's yours? Come on now. What's your podcast?
I like All Songs Considered. I'm an NPR kind of a guy.
Aw, so thoughtful.
Sorry. All right. So this is a little self-serving. I do SEO for a living, so voice search is something that's near and dear to me. Colin mentioned that I've been kind of active in the marketplace. According to eMarketer, 31 million people in the U.S. will shop via a smart speaker in 2019, which is up 31.6% from 2018. And then they say by 2021, this figure will climb to 38 million, as more than 4 in 10 U.S. smart speaker users look to these devices to make a purchase. Are you as bullish on that trend? I guess we'll start here.
I'm absolutely. This was actually the debate at my dinner last night. I can't see it not, especially with the kids coming up. It's part of their life, the way cell phones are for us, but the rotary phone were for your parents. I can't see it going away. It adds convenience. It adds multitasking. I mean, the issues are the privacy and the trust, and what are they going to do with my data? Are they listening to everything? I mean, your phone is probably listening to everything too then. So I can't see it not. The flip side I've heard at dinner last night was I don't get any value out of it. I bought in when I had a kid. I get a ton of value out of it, and I found other value exchanges within doing so. I think it's totally going to take over.
Anybody else?
I'm absolutely bullish on it, but for a different reason. We think about like 20 years ago, when Xerox came out with it, and IBM and Microsoft, and then Apple came up with the desktop metaphor, right? Like right now on our laptops, we all go, there's a trash can, there's files, etc. Now the future of our home and our lives is an operating system piece here, right? So whether it's Google or Alexa, that battle that's going on is how are we going to operate our future? How is that assistant going to be, and which one's going to win? I find that very fascinating. I see a lot of money coming into it. We all see it everywhere, so especially if you go to San Francisco, you're in the airport, you'll see it everywhere. But it's basically, that's what we're dealing with. What is going to be the predominant operating system of our lives in the next 2 to 3 years? So it's not me being bullish on it in a kind of abstract sense. It's gonna happen. The smart home isn't something that the smart home was supposed to be something we got from a technology company that was, I don't know, it was gonna be a device and some light bulbs and call it a shade. What it is actually an operating system. And those speakers, to me, are much more about that than it is anything else.
What do you think will reduce the barriers for voice adoption and people actually buying things on the devices?
I second that.
Our kids. I think similarly, I joke and say my kids have an attitude with Alexa. They yell at her all the time. They tell her what to do. And I think for them, it's very comfortable in their lives. It's a part of what they do. I think the next generation for sure will have a higher adoption of this. I think for me, I use it for the basics, but for them, it really is like, and it's a sort of entertainment, of fun, of music, of a million other things, and it's like another person almost in our household. So I think the next generation will have a higher adoption and more ease of adoption, similar to cell phones and everything else.
Yeah, for us, we're native. Like iHeartRadio is native on all Alexa and Google Home. You could go home and say, hey Google, I'm from New York. I'll say play Z100 and it'll play. Convenience, free, and access. Like the moment you start to make that a part of your habitual behavior and it isn't costing you anything, that's the barrier. We look at it that way. I mean, we come from a radio backbone. So now we're seeing a huge resurgence in radio because people are now listening to it passively. So the barrier is the habitual access to content that is there for you.
I think it's also like Rahul said, convenience is king, and if podcasts, voice, or anything can insert itself into your behavior with very low friction on the train, driving, whatever it may be, it's going to do very well. You don't have to change your habit loop, if you will. So anything that comes in at low friction like that is just probably going to win. Like Amazon can deliver in 2 days, and now everybody does it, and every other retailer has to do it. Just makes it better for the consumer. Convenience is king.
I'm gonna put my panelist hat on now because I like this question. I want to answer it myself. No, I think it's similar to what you were saying, Rahul. The integration of all of the different devices, I think, is the next level, right? The fact that these devices now have screens and you can see things and you can verify visually that like the thing that you're buying is the thing that you really wanted, instead of just having to like assume that it understands what you mean. I think that's the next level, and having the whole connected home to be able to, see things on your television and things like that from those devices is the best.
I'm just going to add to that. I think what's funny about where we are right now with audio and sound is audio cues will replace visual cues because of how much the super saturation of visual, right? Like one of the things I go around the country is saying, like, do you remember the last Instagram post you liked? Everyone's like, I don't know. Do you remember the song you woke up to that you're still humming? Why? Yeah. Right? So going back to what you're saying, I think what'll happen is like the confirmation tones could be like the lights blink. It could be a sound thing. The opportunities are endless once you start to like really integrate.
Great. All right, so switching gears a little bit, I think we'll go to the omnipresent social media. How can brands leverage, let's say, Twitter to grow their audience? Are there any new ways brands can activate?
Yeah, so I think Twitter's biggest strength is our audience. Not just the size or their makeup, but what mindset they're in when they come to Twitter. We talk about a discovery mindset. They come to have conversations about topics that they're interested in, about current events with people they might or might not know, as well as with brands. So we see an opportunity there for brands to be a part of that conversation. So whatever it is that makes sense for your brand. So let's say fintech, there's a huge conversation around that. People are sharing ideas, best practices, apps that they use. So one of our clients like Robinhood would come in and sort of be a part of that conversation, help shape that, and just align to that as well. So that's what we've seen as most successful, and connecting with that conversation with what's happening, current events, pop culture, sports, world events, as well as launching something new, because people are in that mindset of like being the first to know, to adopt. And in terms of what's new, not really super new, but we have strong initiatives around video, and a lot of brands are actually not leveraging video. We see that it's the best vehicle to deliver your message. It has the most stopping power on the feed, and ends up being way cost effective as well. So we have a lot of initiatives around that, and that's the first thing that we recommend.
Yeah, it's interesting because Twitter is very text heavy, right? So adding that visual element is a stopper, right? Like, oh, there's something else in this, and you kind of stop scrolling.
And short video, but yeah.
Another thing about Twitter that I love is, and it's kind of a really fun parallel, we actually ask on audio, what are the conversations you want to be having around your brand? Like, just think about it. It's such a simple strategy kind of question. Like, every brand should be like, geez, what kind of conversations do I want to have? Twitter is exactly that. It's a conversational medium, just like audio, like radio is, where people are speaking to each other. Asking that to a brand and then inspiring that conversation, Twitter is like a natural fit of growth. So that your brand is going, okay, because now, like, you guys brought back, like, I remember we were doing a piece with Unilever for Popsicle, bring back the double pop, if you guys know Bieber and Scooter Braun and the hilarity that happened around that. And they had to get like 100,000 retweets in 3 days to bring back the double pops. Popsicles went from 2 to 1 because someone saved money, and now they wanted them back. So you can split them and give it to get a friend. And Twitter was instrumental in that conversation. If you do a little research on it, you'll find out how important culturally that was. So mazel. That is the kind of way that you can kind of drive and grow a family around it.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what Rahul was saying. I think it's about like not just using Twitter as a channel to communicate, but to understand bottom-up culture of what people are talking about, and in your category specifically. So you may not need to necessarily be constantly promoting things on Twitter, but understanding what people are doing, what they're talking about, and what they care about. That's how the popsicle incident happened, Burger King, and their latest marketing efforts. They used Twitter as a platform, but they also used it to understand what people wanted and what they were talking about and how they can have the most impact.
All right, so staying with social media, though, let's talk about something emerging here. A lot of people are talking about TikTok. Should this be on everybody's radar, or is this just something that we can ignore as a fad?
I think for me, I urge everybody, if you are a marketer, to understand any platform. I think Twitter is more about, TikTok is more about consumer behavior and understanding that. So whether it's TikTok or something else that lives on from here, that idea of people wanting to watch short, unproduced, unscripted content from people is something that you should pay attention to. TikTok as a platform, it could live on forever, it could die, it could be something else, Twitter could acquire it, we don't know. But I think understanding that, and it goes to the podcast point of what people want, and I think TikTok is another representation of that. People want short content quickly from people that they trust and they listen to, that they can just kind of scroll through and spend 40 minutes kind of absorbed in as another channel.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, for a brand, regardless of like you said, if TikTok stays around or not, you need to be where your customer is or where you want your message or where the conversation is happening. And if it's, maybe like a younger audience these days doing that, I think you shouldn't overlook that.
I think specifically for Gen Z, if you're targeting Gen Z, I don't know anyone in the office who may be, but I think that's an important channel, knowing if your audience is there. But I think you can borrow kind of the trends of TikTok for your audience without necessarily having to be there.
Okay.
Just the one detail that I think it needs to be recognized is the unscriptedness of it. I think that we are actually becoming almost anti-advertising in the way we consume. So if you think about it, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Twitter, whether it's an endorsement on the radio, all these mediums are getting messier and less formed. When you see a commercial right now that is beautifully shot, epic, you're like, okay, that's a commercial, and you kind of turn that off or you look for the skip button. Why a TikTok or a Twitter kind of object, it's that people are just being honest and open and messy, and that is actually where we are going to in the media space. So,
authenticity matters, and my 3-year-old can see the difference. He knows exactly how to turn off any ad, and we're going to see more of that. But authenticity really matters, and it's not necessarily easy to do unless you authentically understand your customer, listening to them, monitoring, et cetera, and then connect with them and be true. And the more you are, the better your brand will be.
All right, piggybacking off of that, I think that lends itself to the influencer conversation. So, can the influencer marketplace sustain itself? Is it always going to be the same? Is it going to change? What do you think?
We were all debating about this backstage. Personally, it'll always be there, like the shaman in the village, the cool kid in the schoolyard in 3rd grade. There's always going to be influencers. It's kind of blown up over the last few years of just can I endorse somebody or have someone on my side on YouTube that will be a fan and authentically promote my stuff. And they have these fraudulent followers and everything. That model, I don't think is going to sustain or grow anymore. I kind of think it's hit its peak. I don't think the influencer thing is going to change too much. It'll always be around, but I don't see it taking over. And now it's just, influencers everything.
I think what's interesting about influencers to me, and we were talking about this backstage, is there's different types, right? And I think I actually was just thinking about, we've been doing a lot with Gen Z lately and kind of the future of what they pay attention to. And I think about my son. I was trying to think of one person or show or thing that he watches that is scripted. And I couldn't think of one show that he watches that's not a real person doing the things that he likes to do. And I think what's really kind of emerged in that fashion is not the influencer that I think a lot of us in the audience maybe roll our eyes at, which is trying to sell you a million things. I follow one who had to apologize for selling her audience too much shit on the gram. But I think it's more about people who, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, are interested in the things that you're interested in and talking about them. And yes, they may speak to brands that they care about, but I think as in the future, there's definitely going to be more. I think we talked about podcasts being more unscripted, TikTok being a more unscripted place. And influencers, when you think about it, is really anyone who cares about a specific thing who has a camera that they have access to. So I think that trend will continue. I think the unsustainable part of it is them trying to sell you, everything on Instagram. I think that will have to break at some point, but I think the idea of someone being on YouTube, talking to an audience about their passions will continue to evolve.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key with the influencers, and I think like just echoing what you guys said, will always be there, but will continue to evolve. I think the key thing is to make sure that, if they lose their credibility and their authenticity and trying to sell you and like just doing ads, I feel like that's not a sustainable way. I mean, we see that a lot on Twitter, obviously, like whether it's political figures, sports, celebrities just have huge followings and then just influencing a conversation or a purchase decision or a view about something with a simple tweet, right? So it's definitely very powerful.
For us at iHeart, we have over 2,000 on-air influencers. We call our personalities, we don't call them jocks or DJs, because that's not true. A DJ is like Marshmello, going crazy. On-air personalities are having conversations with, on-air influencers are having conversations with America every day. And they're real influencers. A lot of them, a lot of the listeners have grown up with that person for like 20 years, 25 years. And it's not someone who's like just happened to walk into their lives. It's their best friend who they're like, oh, that person likes that steamer versus an iron. Like that suddenly becomes an important endorsement. So for us at iHeart, we actually see influence, as everyone has said here, expanding. When we have a personality on a show now, they have multiple channels of influence. So one of them is this thing, a mic. Then they have their Instagram feed. Then the show has a Facebook presence. Then they are also on Twitter. So suddenly they have more ways to influence than they ever have. So that's actually, to me, showing the growth of the potential of having influential voices in our lives. The question ultimately, this is the thing that we were really debating backstage, was also credibility. Like Boon, you kind of talked about that a little bit, like how much is waste or how much is true, how much is bots. And I think the biggest area that we have to kind of like tighten up on is the true visibility into what that influence is for brands.
All right, yeah, and I think that leads us right into the idea of data and that whole side of this creating those audiences and taking that information and retargeting people based upon the information that we get. So how should teams start thinking about their 2020 data strategies, and how do they do that without being creepy?
This is my favorite topic in the world, the privacy thing. So data-wise, the best way I can kind of boil it down is using the metaphor or analogy of a restaurant. If you're going to build a restaurant, you need to know what ingredients you need to get and which farmers have the best ingredients. You have to know that no data farmer out there has perfectly good ingredients. There's no such thing. But you find the best farmers with the best ingredients, you bring it into your restaurant or your data stack. At Distillery, we're tracking 200 billion data points every day across 250 million people in America every day. And the thing you need to know most, garbage in, garbage out, we see approximately 55 to 60% of the data we're using to grow our brands. 55 to 60% is complete garbage. About half of that is fraud alone. The other half is mixed up with engineers, rounding errors, things like that. But if you have garbage in, garbage out, I think it's interesting that the top CMOs and e-marketers say that every year they feel like 55 to 60% of their marketing and media budgets are wasted every year, but they don't know which part is waste. So starting with good ingredients, and then you got to figure out your recipes for the restaurant, which is basically your data architecture. Start small, maybe start with social. You understand over 6 months how it impacts your business, and then you bring in maybe behavioral. So if you put behavioral behind social, how does that work? And then flip it. Try behavioral before social. How does that work? See what tastes better in the soup. and you go through that, maybe it'll take you 2 or 3 years to put a full data strategy together, but along the way, you have to measure everything in incremental steps to understand the impact. Otherwise, I say this in the office all the time, everyone's drowning in data, but no one knows which way to swim. So starting with the best ingredients from the best farmers is the best place to start, and then iterate slowly over time.
I think that says it best. So I think we've gone through the whole gamut of things, social media, voice, podcasts, and all the way down to data science. So that's all the time we have. I want to thank you guys. That was a really great discussion, and we'll be out here if you guys have any more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.